In the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harkin, Hatch, Heller, Inouye, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Lugar, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Snow, no. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye.
He didn't give me the sheet. I just gave me. Any senators wishing to cast their votes on this vote? The yeas are 40, the nays are 58. The amendment is not agreed to. The majority leader. Without objection.
I have 40
Under the
consent requests for committees to meet during today's session.
out of the order, the clerk will read the bill for the third time.
Pardon me, Mr. President.
Calendar 459, a bill to amend the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and so forth.
Under the previous order, the bill is passed. The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I have 4 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. The Senate, they have the approval of Senator McConnell and me. I ask consent these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Without objection. So ordered.
I now
Majority Leader.
Oh, I'm sorry. I now ask unanimous consent that at 12:50 today, the Senate, 12:50 p.m. today, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 651. There be an hour of debate, equally divided. Upon the use or using back of that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on that. Judge, it's Judge Drain of Michigan, a judge to be at least Drain in Michigan.
Without objection. So ordered.
President.
Senior Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
We're not in a quorum.
He's suggesting one.
Oh, you're seeing. His clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to discuss the troubling state of our financial system and the unfinished business of Wall Street reform. I'm here to talk specifically about too big to fail banks. Decades of deregulation, laissez-faire economic policies helped the 6 largest U.S. banks grow from 18% of gross domestic product only 25 years ago to 68% of gross domestic product in 2009. So from 18% in the mid-1990s to 68% of GDP in 2009. We know what happened next. During the financial crisis, these 6 mega banks collected $1.2 trillion. Just to understand that figure, if we can, $1.2 trillion is $1,200 billion, and $1 billion is $1,000 million. I mean, so to think these 6 mega banks collected $1.2 trillion in federal taxpayer-funded support from the Treasury, from the FDIC, from the Federal Reserve. 2 years after we passed Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, and I supported it because it took many important steps, I'm concerned we're not seeing reform, nearly sufficient enough reform in the financial sector. And as we uncover more and more risky, fraudulent, illegal activities, it seems far too clear, and the American people absolutely see this and believe this, that Wall Street is back to business as usual. Since 2010, we've learned about a number of things. I'm just going to rattle off 7 or 8 significant, serious problems, some illegal, some accusations, some alleging significant systemic problems, all troubling issues that have happened just in the last couple of years. Investor lawsuits and SEC enforcement actions over mortgage-backed securities. Municipalities being sold overpriced credit derivatives, bankrupting some of those municipalities, and think of the hardship that causes in those communities. The forging of foreclosure documents and mortgage securities legal documents by 5 of the nation's largest servicers, leading to $25 billion in penalties. $25 billion in penalties for these servicers forging foreclosure documents and mortgage security legal documents. $25 billion in penalties. The nation's largest bank halting all consumer debt collection lawsuits due to concerns about poorly maintained and inaccurate paperwork. The nation's largest bank losing $5.8 billion so far on large complex derivative trades. The regulators either missed or didn't understand or ignored. Suspicions that 16 global banks, including the three largest U.S. banks, manipulated LIBOR, the London Interbank Overnight Rate, that's used as a benchmark for mortgages, for credit cards, for student loans, and even for derivatives. Financial instruments that affect almost everybody in our country. A criminal bid, this is part of this list of problems since 2010, Madam President, a criminal bid rigging trial exposing illegal practices by many Wall Street banks and arranging bids so that banks could underpay for municipal bonds. Former employees of the nation's largest bank alleging the company urged them to steer clients to their own mutual funds because they were more profitable to the bank even though they paid investors lower returns than other funds, while their clients presumably were trusting them to act in their clients' best interest. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission investigating whether the biggest U.S. bank manipulated prices in the energy markets, forcing consumers to pay more. A $175 million settlement by the nation's fourth largest bank for discriminatory lending practices in housing markets that include Cleveland and many other cities, and walk through these neighborhoods and see what foreclosures have done to them, see what rigging of what other behavior on services dysfunction or illegal activities have done to these communities and to these families. And imagine for a moment, put the numbers aside and the political speech aside, and imagine for a moment you're a parent with a 12 and a 13-year-old daughter, and you've got to sit down with them and say, sorry, honey, we're not, Dad lost his job a few months ago. Now we're losing our home. Where are we going to move, Mom? Well, I don't know. What school am I going to go to? I don't know yet. We've got to imagine the personal hurt and hardship caused by a lot of these things to a whole lot of families in Cleveland and Mansfield and Cincinnati and Dayton. More problems since 2010. Regulators are investigating whether the rate that establishes municipal bond prices is susceptible to manipulation. That's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those are just 11 examples, all of them huge separately, and in the aggregate just devastating, potentially, certainly devastating to many individuals, and potentially devastating in a huge way to our economy as a whole. Madam President, the list goes on and on and on. But some experts say we can't, when you talk about potentially these banks forcing them to divest themselves because of their size, some experts say our banks need to compete. You can't, no, our banks need to compete with the banks in other countries. But then does anyone really believe, do any of these bankers on Wall Street or bankers in my state who have acted, frankly, more responsibly, and the community banks and the credit unions and the regional banks, does anybody really believe that we should follow the European model where never-ending bank bailouts have become the norm? We know the world's largest bank at $2.55 trillion, HSBC, helped launder money for Mexican drug traffickers and Middle Eastern terrorists. And as we know by now, all over the newspapers, the 8th largest bank in the world at $2.4 trillion, Barclays, in the city where the Olympics are being held, was the first bank caught manipulating the LIBOR rate. Not exactly, Madam President, models that we should emulate. Financial reform is supposed to reduce industry concentration. It's supposed to end too big to fail. But the financial sector is even more concentrated now than it was before the financial crisis. And you remember, Madam President, what I said at the outset. In 1995, 18% of GDP, the assets of these banks, of the largest banks, 6 largest banks, was 18% of GDP in 1995. By 2009, it was 68%, and it's even worse today. The top 10 banks' assets, 68% in 2006, now 77% at the end of 2010, and growing, presumably. As a result of mergers during the financial crisis, 3 of the 4 largest mega banks have grown by an average of more than $500 billion. Grown by an average of more than $500 billion. They're in the vicinity of $800 billion and $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion and $2 trillion in assets. The 6 biggest U.S. banks have combined assets that are twice as large as the rest of the top 50 U.S. banks put together. So think about that again. The largest 6 U.S. banks, their assets total this. The 50 next largest U.S. banks, big banks to be sure, hundreds of billions in assets, total less than the 6 largest. According to Robert Wilmers, the CEO of M&T Bank, the 6 biggest banks in the United States account for 35% of all U.S. deposits, 35% of all U.S. deposits, 53% of U.S. banking assets, 56% of all mortgages, and 93% of trading revenues. This is just 6 banks who wield such immense power in our economy. The message to the markets is clear. These trillion-dollar mega banks, they're too big to manage, they're too big to regulate, and they continue to be too big to fail. We have work to do. For all of its benefits, Dodd-Frank's benefits, including a new consumer protection agency and the oversight of derivatives, Dodd-Frank relies upon regulators to get it right this time. But given their track record, sometimes too close to the people whom they regulate, so-called regulatory capture. Sometimes there just aren't enough of them. Other times they may not have the expertise to be able to chase around some of the smartest, best educated, most experienced banking executives who know how to game the system. And also, we don't, in these regulators, simply, we don't always, as I said, have enough of them. That's why I'm skeptical. That's why we need to go beyond the central provisions of Dodd-Frank that increase capital, that establish living wills, that establish a process for orderly liquidation. Those are all good things, but clearly, I just mentioned these 10 or 11 or 12 problems. Those are just the biggest ones. Clearly, that's not enough. Members of Congress in both political parties agree banks need to have much more capital to cover their losses, much more of a financial capital cushion. We agree that institutions should issue more stock, should restrict dividends, should retain their earnings to build bigger buffers. But while countries like Switzerland are considering 19% capital requirements, a ratio of about 5 to 1, U.S. regulators are staying within the Basel III international capital standards, which FDIC Director Tom Hoenig has said simply will not prevent another financial crisis. There's also a living will process that's intended to make it easier to resolve large, complex institutions. We talked a lot about that on Dodd-Frank. Institutions are supposed to tell regulators how they can be dismantled to protect the financial system as a whole and protect middle America when they get into financial trouble. But the proof will be in the results. So far, regulators have yet to begin a process of simplifying the 6 largest banks that have a combined 14,420 subsidiaries. 6 banks have 14,420 subsidiaries. I mention that number because, Madam President, as you think about every look at these 6 banks, every quantifying number that I try to give, every observation of these 6 banks, every delineation of what these 6 banks do and what they are, this speaks of this huge, this behemoth that is too big, that are too big to fail, these 6 banks. They're too big to regulate, they're too big to manage, and they're too big to regulate. And there's Title II orderly liquidation authorities. I've heard my colleagues, including my ranking member, my subcommittee, Senator Corker from Tennessee, who co-authored Title II, note that FDIC and Treasury could keep failing banks on life support rather than liquidate them. Is that what we really want when we think too big to fail, too big to manage, too big to regulate? I've talked to regulators who who have privately told me and told Graham Steele and my staff that they believe our banks are still too big to be allowed to fail because the collapse of banks that size potentially could crush the economy. We remember the fear in the voices of some of the top people in the Bush administration when they talked to us in the fall of 2008 about what was happening to our financial system. I don't think we've answered those fears nearly well enough. This is not capitalism the way it should be. It's not right. Some of my colleagues think the answer to too big to fail requires repeal of Dodd-Frank. This is about as silly as it gets, and a return to the same unfettered free market approach that Alan Greenspan championed for decades, and this led us into this mess. Except Alan Greenspan doesn't even think we should have that again, even though he was #1 cheerleader, he and the Wall Street Journal editorial page, for unfettered, unregulated Wall Street. He is, to his credit, and I don't give him credit for much in most of the last 10 years, but to his credit, he has acknowledged that, yes, indeed, he was wrong, that this unfettered, unregulated Wall Street capitalism simply didn't work for our country. He acknowledges doing that again would be a recipe for financial crises and bailouts as far as the eye can see. Instead, we must face the reality that too big to fail is simply too big. We must enact the Safe Banking Act because too big to fail and too big to manage and too big to regulate have become the norm, especially among these large 6 behemoth institutions. Safe Banking Act, my legislation would place reasonable limits on the share of deposits and the volatile non-deposit liabilities that any one institution could take on. It would require the largest financial companies to fund themselves with more of their own shareholders' equity and less leverage. It would put an end to the government's implicit and explicit support for mega banks, specifically the 6 largest Wall Street institutions that, Madam President, as I spelled out earlier, are in a class by themselves. Remember those numbers. The 6 largest banks, 35% of all deposits, 53% of all U.S. banking assets, 56% of all mortgages, 93% of trading revenues. That's 6 institutions that have that kind of power in the economic marketplace, in large part because of actions here. Our legislation would put an end. Under our legislation, regulators and banking leaders in support of our legislation are increasingly voicing support for this bill. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker recently said that the J.P. Morgan episode might be an illustration that these banks are too big to manage. Former FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair says that shareholders and regulators could force banks to break up, but this legislation would be the most direct way to do it. Richard Fisher, president of the Fed of Dallas, James Bullard, president of the Fed in St. Louis, agree that more needs to be done to address the problem of too-big-to-fail banks. Last week, the architect of the too-big-to-fail banking model, former Citigroup CEO Sandy Weil, said that biggest banks should be broken up. Increasingly, this isn't a partisan issue. The ranking member of the Banking Committee, Republican Senator Shelby from Alabama, supported the Safe Banking Act when it was a floor amendment, when it was the Brown-Kaufman floor amendment. I've heard from more and more of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that they might have voted against it a couple years ago as a floor amendment, but things have gotten worse. The idea is sounding better and better to them. This legislation would protect taxpayers by putting megabank shareholders on the hook for losses, ending bailouts for good. At a time of increasing fiscal constraint, our nation can ill afford to waste precious taxpayer dollars bailing out our largest banks and their recklessness. My legislation would benefit the community banks that are at an unfair competitive disadvantage because mega banks have access to cheaper funding based upon the perception that the government stands behind them. That means studies estimate this support gives mega banks a 70 to 80-point funding advantage. 70 to 80 point basis points means 3/4, 4/5 of a percent on interest advantage, if you will, a subsidy provided provided, for that matter, by the expectation of taxpayer support of up to $60 billion per year. So if you're one of the 6 big banks, you can borrow money in the capital markets at a lower cost than if you're a community bank in Cary, Ohio, or a community bank in Sandusky, or a mid-sized bank in Columbus or Akron, Ohio, because the market knows that we won't let those 6 biggest banks fail. So their lending is a little less expensive because there's a lot less risk. My legislation benefits investors, as many experts agree that the sum of the parts of the largest mega banks is more valuable than the banks as a whole. So when they begin under our legislation, these 6 mega banks, assets from $800 billion to $2.2 trillion, when they begin to divest themselves, there's a reasonably good chance that they will be worth more in the aggregate than they were in the whole. It will benefit Wall Street families, and it will benefit Main Street families and businesses because increased competition will result in better prices, and fraud will be punished with the full force of the law. Just about the only people who will not benefit from my plan are a few Wall Street executives who, frankly, have done just fine the last 10 years. We simply cannot wait any longer for regulators to act. Wall Street's been allowed to run wild for years. Their watchdogs are either not up to the job or in some cases complicit in their activities. How many more scandals will it take before we acknowledge that we can't rely on regulators to prevent subprime lending and dangerous derivatives and risky proprietary trading and even fraud and manipulation? Even if they wanted to do the job, and I think they do, the regulators, it would require 70,000 examiners to examine a $1 trillion bank with the same level of scrutiny as a community bank. So the regulation of the community banks is plenty. But when it comes to the 6 largest banks, we're not even close. Again, they're too big to fail. They're too big to manage. Look at what's happened, those examples I gave, and they're too big to regulate. Simply, we can't rely on the market to fix itself. The 6 largest Wall Street mega banks are essentially an oligopoly and a cartel, making true competition impossible. Mega bank shareholders and creditors have no incentive to end too big to fail because they get paid out when banks are bailed out. They get paid out when banks are bailed out. And banking laws prevent meaningful management shakeups because any hostile takeover effort would require Federal Reserve approval. That's why it's time for Congress to act in the interest of the American public. It's time to restore the public's confidence in our financial markets. It's not there now, to be sure. It's time to put an end to Wall Street welfare and government subsidies. We've seen far too much of that. It's time to enact, Madam President, the Safe Banking Act. I yield the floor.
The senator from Rhode Island.
I see the senator from North Dakota on the floor and wonder if he seeks recognition. As my chairman on the Budget Committee, I'm inclined to give him precedence.
President,
The senator from North Dakota.
through the chair, I would say to my colleague that I do have a matter that's a parliamentary inquiry, that is a matter that is important for us to resolve. I don't know. I don't want to intrude on the senator's time if he's.
May I suggest, if I may, Madam President, that the senator proceed, and it would be helpful to me if he could give me an indication, first, of how long it might be, and second, that we enter into a unanimous consent that I be recognized following his remarks.
More than 4 minutes.
Perfect.
Without objection. The senator from North Dakota.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to clear up some confusion with respect to the Budget Control Act of 2011. Some have suggested that the Budget Control Act indirectly authorized the Senate to use a fast-track process to modify the across-the-board cuts scheduled to go into effect next year due to failure of the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. Madam President, if that claim were true, it would result in a fundamental change in Senate procedures and prerogatives. However, it is clear in looking at both the statutory language and Congress's intent in passing the Budget Control Act that this claim is completely without merit. First, let's look at what the law actually says. The key provision at issue is Section 258A of the Deficit Control Act of 1985. Section 258A would allow the Majority Leader to introduce a joint resolution to modify or provide an alternative to a sequestration order, quote, and I quote, issued under Section 254, end of quote. That joint resolution could not be filibustered and would pass the Senate with a simple majority vote. The sequestration orders under Section 254 were put in place over 2 decades ago to enforce deficit targets and discretionary spending limits that have long since expired. Madam President, a sequestration order under the Budget Control Act is not an order issued under Section 254. The Budget Control Act created a new sequestration process under a completely different section of the law, Section 251A. Section 251A explicitly authorized a new set of presidential sequestration orders in fiscal year 2013 for both discretionary and direct spending, and did so without any reference at all to the old Section 258A procedures. The statutory language is clear, therefore, that these old procedures do not apply to sequestration under the Budget Control Act. It's also clear that Congress never intended for Section 258A procedures to apply. There was no discussion of this issue on the floor of either House. There was no discussion of this in the Budget Control Act negotiations between congressional Republicans in the White House. And there was no discussion of this among Democratic senators. Moreover, The Budget Control Act and the Deficit Control Act of 1985 are completely separate budget enforcement mechanisms enacted 26 years apart and under entirely different circumstances. Simply put, Madam President, there is zero evidence of any congressional attempt to apply the 258 procedures to the Budget Control Act sequestration. In order to confirm this for the record, I'd like to pose a parliamentary inquiry to the presiding officer. Madam President, is it correct that Section 258A of the Deficit Control Act of 1985 does not apply to the fiscal year 2013 sequestration?
The senator is correct.
I thank the chair. I think that's an important decision to get affirmed publicly so that we might proceed and not be engaged in distractions. I thank the chair and yield the floor, and I thank very much my colleague for allowing me to proceed.
My great pleasure. Madam Chair.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. Kathy Hutchinson last spring picked up a cup of coffee and took a sip. Now, why have I come to the floor of the United States Senate to talk about Kathy Hutchinson last spring picking up a cup of coffee and taking a sip? Because 15 years earlier, Kathy Hutchinson was working in her garden when she suffered a stroke that left her paralyzed. Kathy didn't just lose the ability to use her arms and legs, she also lost the ability to speak. I'm sorry to say that this condition is not unique to Kathy. It happens regularly enough that there's a medical term for it, locked-in syndrome. And that's how Kathy lived for nearly 15 years, alert and mentally sharp, but unable to move or speak, a prisoner in her own body. All of this changed last spring when, for the first time in nearly 15 years, Kathy picked up that cup of coffee and took a sip. Kathy Hutchinson is a patient enrolled in a clinical trial at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. They're testing a neural interface device known as BrainGate. BrainGate works by placing a small sensor on the brain. The sensor is connected to a computer that interprets the brain's signals to control a specially designed robotic arm. The university researchers asked Kathy to imagine that she was moving her arm in different directions. And then they monitored which neurons fired for those corresponding movements, all in her imagination. Using this brainwave information, researchers attached a robotic arm to the computer. The computer translated the electrical impulses detected by the sensors in Kathy's brain back into commands to tell the arm what to do. Kathy communicates through a device that allows her to type using the movement of her eyes. And she typed that she was ecstatic about the new technology and hopes it can be expanded to one day allow her to walk again. The BrainGate team is also working to determine if this technology can ultimately be used to help individuals paralyzed by stroke or injury to regain greater independence. BrainGate is an example of what is possible when the best minds in science and engineering come together for the common good. Researchers from Brown University, the Department of Veterans Affairs, Massachusetts General Hospital, and the German Aerospace Center collaborated on this project. Their efforts were supported by a grant from the National Institutes of Health, as well as funding from the Veterans Administration and several private foundations. BrainGate is just one of the most recent in a long list of medical breakthroughs that are made possible by our National Institutes of Health. The NIH is the cornerstone of our national commitment to medical research for the benefit of humanity. Research supported by the NIH has led to medical advances that have saved and improved countless lives, while making America the world leader in discovery and innovation. More than 80 Nobel Prizes have been awarded for research supported by the National Institutes of Health. In Rhode Island, Brown University has received NIH grants to support cutting-edge research on a multitude of diseases, including cancer, dementia, and muscular dystrophy. In fact, the scope of projects at Brown that receive NIH support is so diverse that the university describes its NIH-backed research as covering everything from autism to Alzheimer's. And yet, there are those in Congress who have suggested cutting the NIH's budget. Let's be clear about what cutting the NIH's budget means. It means cutting off funding for research that has provided Kathy Hutchinson her first taste of physical independence in 15 years. It means telling the millions of Americans suffering from cancer that they have to wait longer for life-saving research. And it means suffocating a vibrant American area of innovation and job creation. Cutting the NIH budget has ripple effects far beyond just one federal agency. Quite simply, it will hurt job growth. Medical research is one of the fastest-growing fields nationwide. In Rhode Island and across the country, cities are undergoing a renaissance sparked by the growth of high-paying careers in medical research. I've heard friends on the other side of the aisle here talk at length about how we need to do more to create jobs. Well, I could not agree more. Now is no time to put jobs at risk by cutting back on the research funding that makes them possible. I know that the Appropriations Committee recently reported a bill to the floor that would increase the NIH budget by $100 million for the coming fiscal year. I applaud my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee for their commitment to this vital agency, and I hope that we will soon be able to vote on their measure. But there is something looming on the horizon that will render this $100 million increase all but meaningless. I'm talking, of course, about sequestration, under which it is estimated that the NIH will face not a $100 million increase, but a $2.4 billion cut. I know a lot of my colleagues have discussed the effect that the sequester will have on defense spending, but it's important to remember that 50 cents out of every dollar of cuts that will occur under sequestration will come out of non-defense spending, including specifically the NIH. Devastating is the word that keeps being used when people are asked how sequestration would affect our National Institutes of Health. That's how NIH Director Dr. Francis Collins described the effect of a nearly 8% cut to the agency's budget. Those who are familiar with science know how important it is in ongoing experiments that there be a consistent data set through the period of the research. When you interrupt research for financial reasons, you can damage the value of research conducted in other years. I agree with my colleagues that we must reduce our long-term deficit. But when we cut funding that creates jobs and leads to life-saving medical breakthroughs, we are pursuing policies that are the epitome of penny-wise but pound-foolish. I hope that we in the Senate can work together to find sensible solutions that reduce the deficit while maintaining our long-standing commitment to medical research and innovation. We owe that much to Kathy and to the millions of Americans whose futures will be brighter thanks to the research and jobs made possible by our American National Institutes of Health. When Kathy Hutchinson interacts with the BrainGate program, it is hard not to get the sense that you're looking into the future. A future where people like Kathy will know that disease or injury will not transform their bodies into a prison. It was Arthur C. Clarke who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. For Kathy, for the BrainGate research team, and indeed for anyone who may one day benefit from this remarkable technology, that sip of coffee last spring taken by Kathy Hutchinson was a moment of magic. Let us commit ourselves to providing Kathy, the BrainGate team, and all of those who are relying on us in this body to provide the support they need to keep making magical moments like this possible. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Colorado.
Madam President, I'm here again on the Senate floor, as I have been on 14 previous occasions, to urge all of us, to urge my colleagues here in the Senate and, of course, our colleagues down through the rotunda in the House to extend the production tax credit for wind. It's also known by its shorthand as the PTC. The reason I'm here on the floor, and as I've said many, many times before, this is about jobs. If we don't extend the production tax credit as soon as possible, we will lose good-paying American jobs. It's that simple. It's that straightforward. I'm going to keep speaking on the floor of the Senate until we, colleagues, decide to act, until Congress decides to take the necessary action to extend the production tax credit, protect American jobs. I want to underline that. We're going to protect American jobs and help secure our energy future in the 21st century, where clean energy will be a dominant part of the mix. Madam President, it's been a treat to come to the floor to do this on one hand because I'm touring the country. I focus on a state when I come to the floor. And today I want to focus on the great state of Oregon, where the wind industry is a major part of their economy and where the PTC's positive ripple effects have been felt statewide. In short, Oregon is a national leader in wind power, and I want to share some of the statistics to make the case. According to the American Wind Energy Association, Oregon ranks 6th in power derived from wind. The wind energy industry supports roughly 3,000 jobs in Oregon, and that number is poised to grow, but only if we extend the production tax credit. As you look at the map here of Oregon, you can see that Oregon has installed extensive wind power projects along the Columbia River Valley in the northern part of the state. The Columbia basically delineates the state of Oregon from the state of Washington right here along its northern boundary. And there are enough projects there producing enough power so that 700,000 homes would have electricity from those wind power projects. The Bigelow Canyon Wind Farm is the 9th largest wind farm in the nation. And Oregon's 2nd congressional district, which is a very big district, much like the Western Slope District in Colorado, the 3rd district, it ranks 4th in the United States for installed wind capacity. And over the last decade, one county alone, a relatively small county here, Sherman County, has seen over $17 million in revenues come into that county due to the simple presence of the wind energy industry. And that money has helped Sherman County do some impressive things. They've created jobs and improved their infrastructure, including building a new public school and library, supporting the Sherman County Historical Museum, and installing solar panels on county property. A nice hybrid system is in place using renewable energy with those solar panels. These are impressive achievements and investments. I think you get where I'm heading here. Oregon's wind energy potential is tremendous. Currently, there are plans to more than triple the amount of power that Oregon gets from wind. That would mean in a total of 9,000 megawatts of electricity. That would power over 2 million homes. And moreover, such a move, such an investment would create thousands of jobs. I want to go back to my main point here. The wind production tax credit has been a major driver of this growth in the last decade, encouraging wind industry producers to invest in Oregon and the rest of our country. The PTC has encouraged American innovation. Innovation is how we're going to grow our economy, and it's supported American companies in the wind energy sector. But interestingly enough, and I know the presiding officer knows this, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk about her great state of North Carolina in the future, the PTC has enticed foreign companies to bring their operations and the jobs therein to the United States. Because of the PTC, these companies are building factories and offices in the United States. I like to talk about Vestas. It's a Danish company. It has a significant manufacturing presence in Colorado. There are 4 different plants in Colorado. In fact, last Saturday I was at the Vestas plant in Pueblo, and they support many jobs in Colorado. But Vestas has a strong presence in Oregon as well. In fact, their U.S. headquarters are located in one of the most livable cities in the world, that being Portland. And they have made a real statement, Vestas has, about the potential here in the United States. But, Madam President, again, the point I'm making is that it's clear to me and a large, growing, and bipartisan group of colleagues in both houses of the Congress, including, I should say, both of my colleagues from Oregon, Senators Merkley and Wyden, that extending the production tax credit is the right thing to do. It's the right thing for our future, for our economy, and for our environment. And without the PTC, we should look at the other side of this success story. Without it, the sustained growth of the wind industry in recent years will slow. There's no doubt about that. It already has. Possibly halt. And we actually may see good-paying American jobs that will be lost to China and other countries. Why would we want that to happen? We cannot let that happen. And the continued uncertainty is not right. It's not fair when it comes to our U.S. wind industry and the people who work in that sector. Last Saturday, I heard from the workers at the Vestas plant in Pueblo, the tower plant, that they didn't know whether they were going to have their jobs in a few months. The looks on their faces alone should motivate all of us to get the wind production tax credit extended. This is also an opportunity for us in the Congress to show the American public that we're not as dysfunctional as a Congress as the public believes. This is a chance to support economic growth and American manufacturing right here in our country. The American people expect us to produce results, and we can only do so by working together. And I fear, Madam President, that the wind production tax credit has become a political football. We have a chance to show the American public who are sick of campaign year rhetoric and politics and business-as-usual partisanship that we can rise above it. And I want to reiterate again, this is a perfect opportunity for us because this is not a partisan issue. It has widespread support from both parties across our country, and I've been highlighting that fact over these last few weeks. So what can we do? We ought to understand that the production tax credit equals jobs. We ought to pass it as soon as possible. And Madam President, as I wind down, I want to note that the Senate Finance Committee is meeting right now to consider a tax extenders package. And I know many of my colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee, including Oregon Senior Senator Ron Wyden, are working to include the PTC in the package. And I want to add my voice to those that are already in place, urging the Finance Committee to pass an extension of the PTC today as a part of the tax extenders package. And then let's move the full Senate to the point where we can pass the PTC as soon as possible. Why? Because we're protecting American jobs and we're setting the ground, we're preparing the ground for additional job creation in this crucial, growing, exciting 21st century industry, the wind energy industry. Madam President, thank you for your interest. Thanks for what your great state is doing for wind power. I look forward to talking about North Carolina in the near term. And with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I'm delighted to follow the distinguished senator from